The dashboard clock flickered 2:17 a.m., casting long shadows across Ricardo's tired face. Rain streaked the windshield of his sedan, blurring the already dim streetlights of the city's outskirts. Another late night, another attempt to pad his meager income as a rideshare driver. He sighed, tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed, a new request popping up on the app. A pickup point on the old highway, a stretch of road notorious for its isolation and local ghost stories. He almost declined, a shiver running down his spine despite the warm air blowing from the vents. But the fare was higher than usual, a tempting incentive. He accepted. As he navigated the winding roads, the city lights faded behind him, replaced by the inky blackness of the countryside. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the car like nervous fingers. He switched on his high beams, the headlights cutting through the downpour, illuminating the slick asphalt ahead. The pickup point was marked near a dilapidated bus stop, a relic of a bygone era. As he pulled over, he noticed a figure huddled under the meager shelter, a woman. She was dressed in a pristine white wedding gown, the fabric clinging to her slender frame, soaked by the rain. A long, flowing veil partially obscured her face. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest. He'd heard the whispers, the tales of a bride who died in a tragic accident on this very road, her spirit forever searching for her lost love. He tried to dismiss it as folklore, but the sight before him was undeniably unsettling. He rolled down the window, forcing a polite smile. "Good evening. Are you the passenger for the ride to Willow Creek?" The woman slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, though shadowed by the veil, held an unnerving intensity. She didn't speak, but nodded almost imperceptibly. Ricardo unlocked the passenger door, his hand trembling slightly. She moved with an ethereal grace, as if gliding rather than walking, and settled into the seat. The car dipped slightly under her weight, but the interior remained strangely cold. "Name's Ricardo," he offered, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Still no response. He cleared his throat, starting the engine. "Willow Creek, right? Do you have a specific address?" She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper as if carried on the wind. "Just keep driving." Ricardo hesitated, then shifted into drive. The silence in the car was thick, heavy with an unspoken sorrow. He glanced again in the rearview mirror. The woman stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the steady drumming of the rain. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in the car, that a presence far older and more tragic than the silent bride shared the ride with them. The air grew colder, and a profound sadness settled over him, a weight he couldn't explain. As they drove further into the night, Ricardo felt an inexplicable chill, a premonition that this was no ordinary fare. The rest of the drive to Willow Creek passed in an eerie silence. The bride remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Ricardo tried to focus on driving, but his mind kept replaying the image of her pale face and the chilling emptiness in her eyes. He dropped her off at the edge of town, a desolate intersection where the highway met a narrow, unpaved road. She simply vanished into the darkness without a word, leaving Ricardo with a lingering sense of unease and a hefty fare on his app. The next day, Ricardo couldn't shake the memory of the strange encounter. He found himself researching the old highway, searching for any mention of accidents or ghost stories. He stumbled upon a local forum where users shared tales of paranormal activity in the area. One post, buried deep within the thread, recounted the tragic story of a young bride named Isabella, who had died in a car crash on her wedding day decades ago. The details were chillingly similar to the woman he had picked up: a white dress, a veil, a desolate stretch of road. That night, Ricardo had a vivid dream. He was standing on the highway, the rain pouring down, the twisted wreckage of a car illuminated by flashing emergency lights. He saw a young woman in a wedding dress, her face contorted in pain, reaching out towards a figure he couldn't quite see. The dream ended abruptly, leaving him with a sense of dread and a name echoing in his mind: Gabriel. A few nights later, his phone buzzed again. The same pickup point, the same late hour. A wave of apprehension washed over him, but curiosity and perhaps a morbid fascination compelled him to accept. As he arrived at the bus stop, she was there, waiting, just as before. The rain had stopped, and the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the landscape. This time, when she got into the car, she seemed slightly more present. Her eyes met his in the rearview mirror, and he noticed a flicker of sadness in their depths. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still faint but clearer than before. "You're welcome," Ricardo replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then decided to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. I read something about an accident. A bride." She turned her head slowly, her gaze fixed on him. A single tear rolled down her cheek, tracing a clean path through the remnants of makeup. "His name was Gabriel," she said, her voice filled with a profound sorrow. "We were supposed to start our life together." Her voice trailed off and she looked out the window, lost in her memories. Ricardo felt a pang of sympathy for her, a deep connection to her pain. The air in the car grew heavy again, charged with a palpable sense of loss. He knew then that this was more than just a strange coincidence. He was somehow entangled in a tragedy that had unfolded long ago. The mention of Gabriel hung in the air between them, a heavy, unspoken weight. Ricardo drove in silence for a while, allowing the woman her grief. He glanced at her occasionally in the rearview mirror. Her expression was distant, lost in the past. The moonlight illuminated her face, revealing delicate features and a profound sadness etched around her eyes. She looked younger than he had initially thought, barely more than a girl. What happened?" Ricardo finally asked, his voice soft and hesitant. She turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "It was our wedding day," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We were driving to the church, and then everything went black." She paused, her breath catching in her throat. A drunk driver. He crossed the center line. Ricardo felt a chill run down his spine. He could almost picture the scene, the joyous anticipation, the sudden brutal interruption, the devastating loss. He imagined the young couple full of hope and dreams, their lives shattered in an instant. I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. She looked at him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "He was everything to me," she said, her voice barely audible. "We had planned our whole lives together." As they continued driving, she revealed more fragments of her story. She spoke of the small town where they had grown up, their shared dreams of building a life together, the excitement of planning their wedding. Each detail she shared painted a clearer picture of the tragedy, making it more real, more heartbreaking. Ricardo decided to take a detour, driving towards a small, overgrown cemetery he had noticed near the highway. He parked the car near the entrance and turned to her. Would you like to visit?" he asked gently. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the cemetery gates. She moved with the same ethereal grace as before, gliding through the rusted gates and disappearing among the tombstones. Ricardo followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He found her standing before a weathered headstone, her hand gently tracing the inscription. "Isabella," he read aloud. Below her name was the date of her death, a date that matched the one he had found in his research, the date of the tragic accident. He looked at the woman beside him, her face bathed in moonlight, tears streaming down her cheeks. He knew then, without a doubt, that he was in the presence of a ghost, a spirit trapped between worlds, forever bound to the memory of her lost love. The sight of Isabella standing before her own grave solidified the reality of the situation for Ricardo. He was no longer just a driver giving a ride. He was a witness to a profound and enduring tragedy. He felt a deep sense of empathy for her, a connection to her pain that he couldn't explain. He understood on some level the agony of losing a loved one, the feeling of being incomplete, forever searching for what was lost. Over the next few nights, the calls continued. Each ride became a fragmented conversation, a piecing together of Isabella's story. She spoke more freely now, her voice gaining strength, though still tinged with sadness. She told Ricardo about Gabriel, her fiancé, the man she was supposed to marry. She described him as kind and gentle, with a warm smile and a heart of gold. She spoke of their shared dreams, their plans for the future, all of which were tragically cut short. Ricardo, driven by a growing sense of purpose, began his own investigation into Gabriel. He searched online, scouring old newspaper archives and social media. He eventually found a mention of a Gabriel living in a secluded house not far from the highway, a man who had become a recluse after a devastating personal loss. The description matched what Isabella had told him. One night during their usual ride, Isabella became more insistent. "Please," she pleaded, her voice filled with desperation. "You have to take me to him. I need to see him." Ricardo hesitated. He wasn't sure if it was even possible, if a ghost could interact with the living in such a way. But he couldn't deny the raw emotion in her voice, the deep longing in her eyes. "Where does he live?" he asked softly. She gave him an address, a location just off the highway, a place Ricardo had driven past many times without giving it a second thought. It was an old, dilapidated house hidden behind a thicket of trees, almost invisible from the road. "He's been alone for so long," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. "He never recovered. He blames himself." Ricardo felt a lump in his throat. He understood the weight of guilt, the burden of unanswered questions. He knew he had to help, even if it meant venturing into the unknown. He promised Isabella that he would take her to Gabriel, that he would do everything he could to reunite them, even if just for a fleeting moment. He felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if he had been chosen for this task, as if fate had brought them together for a reason. The next ride, he knew, would be different. It would be the culmination of their journey, the final chapter in a tragic love story. The next time Isabella called, Ricardo felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. This was it, the moment he had been working towards. He picked her up at the usual spot, the desolate bus stop bathed in the pale moonlight. She was quieter than usual, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. As he drove towards the address she had given him, the old house loomed into view, shrouded in shadows. It looked abandoned, the windows dark and empty, the paint peeling from the walls. Ricardo parked the car at the end of the overgrown driveway and turned to Isabella. "We're here," he said softly. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the house. She seemed to shimmer slightly, her form becoming less distinct, almost translucent. She stepped out of the car, her feet barely touching the ground, and glided towards the house. Ricardo followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The front door creaked open as Isabella approached, as if an unseen hand had pushed it inward. They entered a dimly lit living room, filled with dust and cobwebs. An old man sat in a worn armchair by the window, his back to them. He was frail and hunched over, his white hair thin and wispy. "Gabriel," Isabella whispered, her voice echoing through the silent room. The old man slowly turned. His eyes, though clouded with age, widened in disbelief as he saw Isabella. A gasp escaped his lips, and tears welled up in his eyes. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice trembling. A wave of emotion washed over Ricardo as he watched the scene unfold. He felt as if he was intruding on a private moment, a reunion that had been decades in the making. Isabella moved closer to Gabriel, her hand reaching out as if to touch him. Though her hand passed right through his, he seemed to feel her presence. He reached out his own hand, as if grasping at a memory, a phantom touch. "I never forgot you, Isabella," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I always loved you." As Gabriel spoke, images flickered in Ricardo's mind. A young couple laughing in a field of flowers, holding hands as they walked along a beach, the devastating moment of the car crash. He saw the love they shared, the life they were meant to have. Isabella smiled, a radiant, ethereal smile that lit up the room. "I know, Gabriel," she whispered. "I've been waiting for you." As the moment reached its peak, Isabella's form began to fade, becoming more and more transparent. The light in the room seemed to intensify, then slowly dimmed. She looked at Gabriel one last time, her eyes filled with love and peace. Then she was gone. The silence that followed Isabella's disappearance was heavy with emotion. Gabriel sat motionless in his armchair, his gaze fixed on the spot where she had stood just moments before. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face, but there was a sense of peace in his eyes, a quiet acceptance. He had seen her, he had heard her, and he knew that she was finally at rest. Ricardo stood silently by the door, not wanting to intrude on Gabriel's private moment of grief and closure. He felt a profound sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had played a part in reuniting two souls that had been separated by tragedy, and he knew that he would never forget the experience. After a few minutes, Gabriel turned to Ricardo, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice weak but sincere. "Thank you for bringing her to me." Ricardo simply nodded, unable to speak. He felt a lump in his throat, a mix of sadness and joy. He knew that he had witnessed something truly extraordinary, a testament to the enduring power of love. He left the house quietly, leaving Gabriel to his memories. As he drove away, he glanced back at the house. It no longer seemed as desolate as before. A faint light shone from the window, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Ricardo never received another call from Isabella. The desolate stretch of highway returned to its usual quiet solitude. The stories of the Phantom Bride faded from the local forums, becoming just another legend, a whisper in the wind. A few weeks later, Ricardo found himself driving past the cemetery again. He decided to stop and visit Isabella's grave. He bought a small bouquet of white lilies, her favorite flower according to what she had told him, and placed them gently on her headstone. He stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about Isabella and Gabriel, their tragic love story, and the brief but powerful connection he had shared with them. He realized that the experience had changed him. He had learned about the enduring power of love, the importance of forgiveness, and the possibility of finding peace even in the face of tragedy. He had also learned to confront his own past, his own heartbreaks, and to find a new sense of purpose in his life. As he turned to leave the cemetery, he felt a gentle breeze brush against his face, as if a whisper of thanks carried on the wind. He smiled, knowing that Isabella was finally at peace, reunited with her beloved Gabriel, their love story finally complete. The highway, once a place of fear and mystery, now held a different meaning for him. It was a reminder of the enduring power of love, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, hope and redemption can be found. The night was no longer filled with dread, but with a quiet sense of peace.